Anyone here heard of mindfulness? Yeah? It's of course one of the key Buddhist practices. So we need to talk a little bit about meditation, what it isn't, and so on, to be able to fit it in into this method and understand the purpose of it within this method, right? The purpose is not the same as in Buddhism for enlightenment and so on, although of course you could probably reach those areas in a similar way by doing the same practices. And primarily the reason for it is in order to get those big moments, you have to do a lot of it. We're talking about days of meditation, hours of it, and intense focus and so on, right? And most of us don't have that kind of time in our lives to do it. What we're going to end up doing is stuff that takes you 5-10 minutes, but that it adds up because you're doing it constantly. It becomes as natural to you as, you know, making sure you wear pants before you leave the house, or a skirt if you're a woman, or a man who likes to wear skirts. So we're going to use it for a slightly different purpose. But the reason it's very useful is because mindfulness has a lot of research behind us. Essentially, when you come to the Eastern meditation practices, you have two essential different types. You've got what's called the mindfulness or insight meditations, and you have the concentration meditations. Now, most people tend to be attracted to the concentration meditations, where you maybe look at a candle flame and just focus on that and focus on it intensely and build it up inside your mind and so on. Anyone heard of Kim's Game? I think there's a Kipling wrote a book on that, where you look at objects in the thing and then you close your eyes and you intensely try and visualize all the objects in the thing and so on. These require a lot of concentration, levels of concentration that most of us do not have. Now, we can build up those levels of concentrations, absolutely, but there's a problem with that style of meditation. It's the flight. It's very intense. It gets all the weird phenomena people want, you know, where they feel like they're translocating, where they lose touch with external reality, and then you know, showers of stars come and hit them, and they feel intense emotions and all kinds of stuff. It's very kind of intense experiences. Can be achieved relatively quickly if you have the wherewithal to stick through very arduous concentration practices. But they also have a tendency to detach people a little bit from reality. And this is something that in the meditation circles is not much talked of, but there is a little bit of research on, and it's very important research for our purposes here. And that is meditation-triggered psychosis. Because we have two different styles of meditation, one which is fast and hard, and one which is slow but steady, most people go for the fast and hard route because they want to just, I can do it, right? And unfortunately, a lot of the people that get attracted to the fast and hard route are the ones that have the bigger issues because they want to resolve them more quickly. And so there is a risk that they will detach from everyday reality, lose themselves in these concentration meditations, and go to places where, in traditional parlance, they are mad. Because what they're experiencing is totally disconnected from what the rest of the world is experiencing. And that's not a very useful place to be in unless you're doing it on purpose in a time-limited environment. Do you understand where I'm going with this? Now, there is again, there's very little written on this, but I did come across one PhD who did a study on meditation-triggered psychosis, and in particular, how different meditation groups deal with it. And dealing with it, believe it or not, is through mindfulness. It's more grounding. So when someone is kind of a little psychotic, a little like nuts, to use a technical term, the more experienced meditation teachers will take one look and go, no, this is not your practice. You go to this group, that's going to be better for you. And once they see the signs that they're more stable, then they can join the more intense group again. Do you see where I'm going with this? Now, as it happens, mindfulness is also the most researched of all the mental practices, right? Psychoanalysis has no research behind it. It's a lot of very interesting ideas, some of which kind of bear out in reality, and some of which are just figments of someone else's psychosis. There are many psychotherapeutic practices that have more to do with a pet theory that someone has than with actual neurological stuff. And by the way, I include with this hypnosis, right? As much as I love hypnosis and as many wonderful results as I've ever achieved with it, those results are purely anecdotal. They haven't been researched in the more stringent scientific method sort of sense. Does that make sense to you guys? It's important to understand that. Just because something hasn't been researched doesn't make it valuable. It just means that you're more prone to errors, which means your conclusions should be a bit more cautious than stuff that's been researched more fully, if you get what I mean here. So let's get back to the idea of mindfulness. This has been researched intensely, especially over the last 10 years. And the reason I think it's particularly interesting is because that research is both pragmatic research in terms of people who meditate are like this before, after a certain period of time of doing these exercises, they are like this now. So it's a very strong correlation, and by having other groups that aren't meditating in that particular way, who don't have those same results, you can quite confidently ascribe the changes to the meditation practice. Do you understand? The other reason it's important is because we actually have much better technology for actually seeing what's going on inside the brain. PET scans, fMRI scans, and so on tell you what's going on inside. And that tells us that mindfulness meditation alters the actual architecture of the brain. If you looked at the highways of the brain, neurons connecting to each other and so on, and you look at someone who's done a lot of meditation, it will look different. Now here's the bit that's most interesting to us. Let's talk a little bit about your brain, just to understand why we're doing certain things. If you take your right or left hand, whichever you're more comfortable with, because you'll be touching yourself right about there, and place it on your forehead and let the hand wrap around. The area that your hand is covering, especially if it's kind of open a little bit, is known as the, well, not the skull, but if you were to touch your brain directly, which would be unpleasant, but it would be interesting. That's called the frontal lobe, or the frontal cortex. That's the bit that makes you human, right? If you just hold your forehead now, this is called your prefrontal cortex. There's a whole bunch of different areas inside of here, and these areas are of particular interest to us. Within these areas, when these have been developed properly, you end up having various psychological benefits. They're responsible for certain psychological traits, shall we say, that if you ask pretty much most psychologists in the world, they would agree that those are a sign of a healthy, stable mind. If you ask most everyday people, and you translate that into everyday parlance, they'd say, yes, that would be a person that is a good, stable, healthy person, mentally speaking, right? The number of these traits, these functions that the prefrontal cortex runs, the one we are particularly interested in right now, although we're interested in several of them, but the one which is most important for the practice that we're going to do is there are these fibers called GABA fibers. Those of you who want to have the long version of them, it's gaminobutyric acid. And they link your prefrontal cortex directly through the limbic system. The limbic system is your mammalian brain, your more instinctual brain. It's where your emotions are generated and things like that. The GABA fibers are interesting because they switch off fear. The stronger the GABA fibers, the larger the bundle of fibers becomes, the more easily you can cope with fear and frightening situations. Do you begin to understand, or do you begin to see and have a sense that developing this part of your brain will be particularly crucial to us if we wish to take flight into the more nether regions of our own minds, right? You see, there are two portions to the terror. One is the neurological, the neurochemical experience of there's a dump into your system of adrenaline and noradrenaline, all kinds of other stuff. And the other one is your interpreter trying to make meaning out of it, right? Which, by the way, is located in your left hemisphere. There's a nice little bit of research on that one. The problem is, if you have a sensation of panic and identify with it, then it becomes real for you. Then all there is panic, and it's not a nice place to be in. That's what happened the first few times. When you can observe that particular experience, so you're still having a neurochemical experience, but you know it's not you, it's a lot easier to cope with, isn't it? And whilst you're coping with it, guess what you're building? Your GABA fibers. the bits that switch the panic off, which means the panic has never been as intense anymore as the first time you had it. Would that be fair to say? It's because it's training, it's unfortunate training because you don't want necessarily to be thrown into panic to be able to do with it. But basically any function that you have, the more you do it, the stronger it gets, right? If you want a society that's courageous, they need to practice courage. If we make life safe, you'll basically have a bunch we will be a society of cowards, not because we're incapable of being courageous, but because we don't have the neural networks that shut off fear and let us do things despite fear and so on, haven't been exercised. They'll blow a fuse at a small amount of challenge, whereas with practice, you would be able to tolerate much larger amounts of fear, problems, and so on, right? If you want a good example of this, look at people who've just recently been in war, right? They have a very different understanding of the world than when they were trained to be a soldier and oh, this is good fun, right? So your ability to deal with fear is very, very important, especially in any self-related work. Because if you cannot deal with fear, panic, terror, then how on earth are you going to work with yourself? You can work with those things that are already strengths. That's your light side, the fun stuff like, oh, this is great, this is fantastic, and so on, right? But I suspect those things won't get you out of bucket land because the walls of bucket land were put up on purpose to protect you from those things that were too terrifying for you to deal with. Do you understand? Yeah?